My name's Lucas, and I've always been a night owl. Working late shifts at the call center just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, meant my routine was pretty much the opposite of the average person's. Most folks are heading to bed when I'm clocking out, craving that midnight snack or a cup of coffee to wind down after a long night. That's how I found myself becoming a regular at this little 24/7 diner on the edge of town. It wasn't anything special, but it had character, and the folks there were always nice to me. One night, or early morning rather, in mid-November, I stopped by the diner after my shift. It was around 3 a.m., a time when the world feels almost too quiet, like you're the only person left awake. I remember pulling into the nearly empty parking lot, the neon sign buzzing softly in the stillness, casting a warm glow that seemed inviting against the backdrop of the dark, empty fields surrounding the place. Inside, the diner was as I expected, quiet, with just a couple of other loners scattered around, probably with stories much like mine. I took my usual spot at the counter, greeted by a nod from the night shift waitress, Marlene. She was an older lady, had been working there for years, and had a kind of no-nonsense warmth about her. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring me a cup of coffee without waiting for my order. "You know it," I replied, managing a tired smile. "Just the usual, thanks." As Marlene went off to put in my order, I sipped my coffee and looked around. That's when I noticed him for the first time, a man sitting alone in a booth near the back, his features obscured by the dim lighting and a low-slung hat. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him at first glance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He was just sitting there, not eating, not drinking, just staring out the window into the darkness. I tried to brush off the feeling, focusing instead on my phone, scrolling through endless feeds to pass the time. But the sense of unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing minute. It was like a prickle on the back of my neck, a whisper in the back of my mind telling me to leave, to get out of there. Then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered. Once, twice, plunging the diner into a brief moment of darkness before they steadied again. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the few patrons, and Marlene made some joke about the place being haunted to lighten the mood. But my eyes were drawn back to the man in the booth. When the lights flickered, he had moved. No longer sitting, he was now standing, facing away from the window, his gaze fixed directly on me. It was a piercing stare, one that seemed to see right through me, and it sent a chill down my spine. I realized that I hadn't seen him move, not once, not even a twitch, until that moment. Marlene brought my food over, breaking the moment. "Everything okay, hon?" she asked, noticing my pale face. "Yeah, just tired, I guess," I lied, forcing myself to look away from the man and focus on my meal. But as I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing up, finding the man's gaze locked on mine every time. It was unsettling, to say the least. I ate quickly, my appetite gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. I paid my bill, leaving a generous tip for Marlene, and made my way to the door, my heart racing. I could feel the man's eyes on me the whole time, but I didn't dare look back. Once outside, I nearly ran to my car, locking the doors the moment I was inside. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the diner. The man was now standing at the window, watching me. And in that brief moment before I pulled away, I swear his face seemed to change, morphing into something inhuman. It was only for a split second, but it was enough to convince me that what I'd felt in there wasn't just my imagination. I drove home faster than I should have, glancing in my rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see that man following me. But the roads were empty, the night silent except for the pounding of my heart. On my way to work the next day, as I passed by the diner, I asked Marlene about the man who was sitting in the last booth yesterday. She said that during the time I was there, the place wasn't busy, and no one was sitting in that spot. Hearing this sent a chill down my spine.
I can still remember it like it happened yesterday, yet it's actually been years. My real name is Isabel, and at a time like this, I used to live in one of those growing exurbs around the very heart of the city of St. Louis, Missouri. It's really quite a mundane and peaceful place, and that's exactly why what would happen there will never be forgotten by me. In late October, though, when they threatened a really bad storm to hit the area, then I did not worry much. We'd weathered bad storms before. Though this one, it seemed, right from the start, did have a different feel to it. The day had peculiarly still surroundings, muffled by a heavy, pressing silence, almost as though to drown the usual sounds of the neighborhood. My roommate Jenna and I just planned to sit down on a Friday night and watch another 100th new series. But when this came about with the darkness falling and lapping the windows of our house with some first breezes, we lost the power. The complete block went dark, plunging us into a sudden blackout. We should have prepared for this, Jenna said, rummaging through drawers for candles and a lighter. I remember laughing it off, assuming that the power would be back on in no time. How wrong I was. Huddling in the corner of an ink-stained, musty hotel, the night had almost matched its volume to pace. Such almost equaled in volume to the pounding rain lashed on the windows as we just started to feel we were in the eye of a storm when the storm outside gathered force, almost in proportion to the night descending on us. Jenna and I had nothing but to move our camping to the living room, surrounded by our fortress of blankets and pillows. Toward midnight, while the storm was at its highest, there was a tapping. A little soft sound at first, almost imagined. Then it came again, more insistent this time. Knock, 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 on the front door. Who could possibly be out in this? Jenna whispered, a hint of fear in her voice. Now I was freaking out with my heart racing, thinking about the alternatives. We live in a highly secure neighborhood, but the thought of opening our door to a stranger in the middle of a blackout, when everybody can't be reached for help if it were needed, was hell. And yet, there was something in me that couldn't quite squelch the idea that someone might be out there needing help. Gathering up what I could of my dwindling courage, I decided to check. I had begun taking tiny steps toward the door with Jenna right behind me, clutching the baseball bat we'd kept for protection. Peeking through the peep, I saw nothing but the blackness of the stormy night. There was a sharp, panicked knock, louder. My hand hesitated, hovering above the doorknob. Through intuition, and anything else, I suppose, that governs action in matters of mere safety, I knew, against my better judgment, I opened the door. It was nobody, it was only that long wail of the wind and the ceaseless rain, and the loneliness that froze my bones. Jenna and I peered into the night, and nothing peered in return. So, almost beat but determined, Jenna and I were just about to head back inside our home to not turn where we heard something, a soft, quavering cry that cut over the tempest outside. It sounded like a child. "Help me," a small voice sobbed, from somewhere out in the darkness. Jenna and I exchanged a glance, the same thought mirroring in our eyes. Somewhere out there was a baby, alone, and scared in the middle of this storm. Nor could the baby be left out there. Ignoring every horror movie that screamed this was a bad idea, we took up clocks and stepped out into the night, determined to find where the cries were coming from. "Coming to help," we answered, in the dark closeness. The child in the early darkness was crying. Meanwhile, the crying insisted, a beacon that led on farther and farther from home. And that's when things took a turn for the bizarre. The sound always a pace or two ahead of them, winding off further and further into the night. Familiar streets turned, in our vicinity, they turned in the labyrinth of dark shadows and fear, leading us to places untraveled and disorienting all of us a little more. It is like the storm swallowed our world through some looking glass and left us in a twisted dimension of it. Of course the crying had stopped now, and nothing does quite convey terror like absolute silence does. Jenna and I stopped, each of us trying to feel our way out, and then knowing the truth, that the cries didn't lead us to a child at all. It had led us away from our home, into the heart of the storm, and whatever had lured us out here may not be human at all. "Let's go back," said Jenna with a voice almost scared out of her. We had decided to move, try and find our way back down any street. But every street looked the same in the blackness and the barrage of rain. The streetlights, possibly guiding us home, stood like unlit sentinels whose faces were staring down at us, dark and unhelpful. And it was Jenna who said it, "A change of wind has come." It had been driving us, blowing and swirling in our backs as we searched, but now it was urging us from the front. "Maybe it's trying to guide us home," she said. Hope was a fine thread in her words. So we pursued the wind, as it were directing us through this labyrinth of known but now strangely shadowed streets. For an hour, or thereabout, we continued, struggling with our cloaks soaked and heavy, to wit, as our spirits with fear. But lo and behold, as at an instant, rain had ceased to fall, the clouds broke away, and a moon in part visible began to shed her silver light upon the wet streets. It was enough to give us our bearings, to guide us back to our neighborhood, and, finally, the front door of our house. How good it felt to see the house, to know we were safe. We dashed into the house, slamming and locking the door behind us, collapsing against it with exhaustion and shock. After the storm, the rest of the night was spent scrunched in the living room while every creak and groan of the house settling had us jumping. The storm was still so fresh in our minds that even as the timid first light of dawn peeked through the windows, it wasn't until then that we finally allowed our tense shoulders to come back down. But the truth is, it wasn't over. Not really. The neighborhood bustled the next day, responded to an aftermath not just of the storm, but of something else. Off-key, off-kilter. It didn't fit. The neighbors spoke of hearing a child crying in the night, being lured outside, just like us. But no child was ever found. No one could explain the source of the cries.
Life in the small, coastal town of Marlin's End was as predictable as the tides. Nestled on the rocky shores of Maine, it was a place where everyone knew your name and your business often before you did. My family had lived in Marlin's End for generations, running the local hardware store that catered to the town's modest population and the occasional adventurous tourist. At 24, I found myself back home after college, helping to keep the family business afloat in a world increasingly leaning towards the convenience of big box stores over the charm of local commerce. It was a late October evening, with the Atlantic wind carrying the promise of an early winter. The trees lining Main Street had shed their leaves, and the town was adorned with pumpkins and harvest decorations, a testament to the community's embrace of the season. That night, I was tasked with closing up shop, a responsibility I'd taken on more frequently as my parents began to entrust me with more aspects of the business. As I locked the front door, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows on the deserted sidewalk. The air was tinged with the smell of salt and decaying leaves, a signature scent of autumn in Marlin's End. Deciding to take a detour home through Clifford Park, named after the town's founder, I zipped up my jacket against the chill. Clifford Park was a small, well-maintained space in the heart of the town, with a path winding through it that offered a scenic route home. It was quiet at this hour, the playground empty and the benches unoccupied. The only sounds were the distant crash of the waves against the cliffs and the rustle of the wind through the remaining leaves. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the eerie feeling that would soon engulf me. As I walked, I noticed a light flickering in the gazebo at the center of the park. Initially, I thought it might be a leftover decoration from a recent community event, but as I drew closer, I realized the light was coming from a single, old-fashioned lantern, hanging from the gazebo ceiling. Beneath the lantern stood a figure, a woman, dressed in what appeared to be an old-fashioned fishing garb, reminiscent of the town's early settlers. Her back was to me, and she seemed to be staring out towards the sea, motionless. Curiosity piqued, I approached the gazebo, my footsteps muffled by the grass. "Excuse me," I called out, hoping to catch her attention. There was no response. She remained still, a sentinel watching over a sea that had claimed many Marlin's End residents over the centuries. Drawing closer, I noticed the lantern swaying gently, though there was no breeze within the gazebo to stir it. The air around her felt colder, and a sense of unease began to gnaw at me. "Ma'am," I tried again, louder this time. Still, she did not move or acknowledge my presence. It was then that the lantern's light seemed to brighten, casting a harsh glow on the figure. I stopped dead in my tracks. Where her face should have been, there was nothing. No features, no contours, just a blank expanse of skin. A shiver ran down my spine, and the air seemed to grow colder still. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the figure. As I did, the lantern began to flicker more violently, as if caught in a storm. The figure turned towards me, or at least I felt it did, for without eyes, it was impossible to tell where she was looking. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the gazebo, extinguishing the lantern and plunging us into darkness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, not stopping until I reached the safety of my home. I locked the door behind me, panting, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The next day, I mentioned the encounter to my father, expecting skepticism. Instead, he grew pale. He told me of an old town legend, one I had dismissed as a child's tale, about the widow of the waves. She was said to be the spirit of a woman who lost her husband to the sea, waiting eternally for his return, her face washed away by her tears and the salt spray. Since that night, I've never taken my peaceful, predictable town for granted again. I avoid Clifford Park after dark, and on windy nights, when the sea roars against the cliffs, I swear I can hear the faint ringing of a lantern's bell, a reminder of the mysteries that lie in the heart of Marlin's End.